Hi, I'm Jeff Stark, and thanks for being with me today. This is the ninth video of a series of videos that we've titled Quarreling and Fighting. Number 8 video in the series of Quarreling and Fighting dealt specifically with this matter of why people get defensive in the context of quarreling and fighting. This is the second video that's addressing the matter of defensiveness. And we'll probably have a video number 3 about defensiveness and number 4 as well, all into the context of the video series called Quarreling and Fighting. In Quarreling Fighting number 8, which was the first video discussing defensiveness, we talked about what defensiveness in the context of arguing and quarreling really looks like. What is it? What does it look like when someone, or when you or your spouse perhaps, or your children get defensive? What does that look like? How does somebody behave when they're being defensive? What does it look like? What does it sound like when someone is being defensive? We looked at that in number 1. Also in number 1, we looked at what are the results of discussions that have quarreling and fighting to it. What happens if quarreling and fighting, and defensiveness in particular, is a systemic problem in your discussions with each other? What's the results of that in marriage? It's not very happy. But to look at what it looks like and sounds like and how a defensive person behaves, you'll want to look at that, as well as the results. You'll want to look at those two things in video number 8 in Quarreling and Fighting. So today we're in this second video regarding defensiveness, and what we're going to be looking at today is why do people get defensive? We all do, and defensiveness is terribly present, consistently present when people are quarreling and fighting. Today we want to look at why do people quarrel and fight and get defensive in particular. Okay? Now we're going to address that as two sides of one coin. Today we're going to look at one side of the coin. The next video, number 3 of defensiveness, will look at the second reason why people get defensive. But let's look at reason number 1, why you, or maybe your spouse or other people you know, why do they get defensive when they're having a quarrel, a fight perhaps, a disagreement, or simply just a disagreement. Why do people get defensive in these situations? Well, number 1, my theory is that people get defensive because they're proud. Pride, I think, is really at the root of why people get defensive. Pride in the sense that people have a high view of where they think they really are. They think that they're this good of a person. They think highly of themselves. They think they're people of good character and good morals and good reactions and good behaviors and good Christians, and they're just good people. And a proud person has a high view of themselves, number 1. Number 2, when they get into a quarrel with their spouse, for example, and when their spouse disagrees with that view and they come in saying, well, I think you're there. If a spouse attacks the person who has a high opinion of themselves and they come in and attack them with words of thinking that they have a low view of them, then that person who has a high view of themselves is probably going to get defensive in ways that we described in the last video. So let me give an example. Let's say you have a typical person who thinks of themselves as a pretty good Christian. They take pride in the fact that they are good people and they're not bad people. But they get into an argument with their spouse, and this wife says, in a fit of anger and disappointment and hurt, she might say something like this to her husband, who has a high opinion of himself. You know, you're rude and you're mean and you're unkind and you're hurtful, and you know, you're just like your father. Well, when a man hears that, when a man who has a high opinion of himself hears his wife coming in, attacking and addressing what she would consider a lower view of him, well, then what you're likely to see the person, that in this case the husband, do is to get defensive, saying something like, that's not who I am. You're wrong about that. I'm not like my father. I'm not mean. Are you crazy? I am not an unkind and a rude person either. And they're going to react viscerally. They're going to react to me defensively, and they're going to defend their character. They're going to defend their integrity. They're going to defend the fact that they think they're good persons and they're not mean persons or rude or something like that. That's my opinion of what makes up why somebody gets defensive. I have a high opinion of me. Someone attacks me at a low opinion, and I'm going to defend my character, my integrity, my goodness, and vehemently and reactionarily, if that's a word, and defensively defend the accusations that's being brought against me. Now, that's how a proud person will react, and we can tell. This is why we know the problem is pride, is because if you say the same thing to a humble person, you're rude and unkind and mean. So let's take a marriage where the guy is humble, biblically humble, okay, and his wife is disagreeable to him and doesn't like the way he's behaving and says something like, you're mean and you're rude and you're unkind. Well, how's a humble person going to react in that situation? Well, he knows that he thinks of himself in the way that the Bible tells him to think about himself. And because he knows that he's a sinner, and he knows that his sins are long and high and deep and broad, and the accusations, therefore, that the wife is bringing against him, he already knows. So what he's going to do is say, you're right. I am mean. I am rude, and I know I can be unkind. I know we've been married for 30 years, and there's been dozens and dozens and dozens of times that I've been mean and cruel and unkind, and I know that I'm very, very capable of being mean. That's how a humble person, someone who has a low view of themselves, but not an unbiblical low view, but a biblical view, which says, there's not much to be not a lot of reasons to think highly of myself, but rather, if I'm thinking biblically, I'm going to be thinking low of myself. And if my wife or my husband says to me, you're mean and unkind and cruel and whatever, you know what? I've already come to grips with the fact that I am that kind of a person. God has told me that over and over in the scriptures. I see the specifics of my lowness. Yes, I am rude. Yes, I am kind. Yes, I can be unmean. And so he's not going to act or react defensively, because he's already come to terms with the fact, having a low view of who he is, or a biblical view of his will. God has already told him that he is systemically mean and rude and unkind and cruel, and is very capable of doing that. He's done that many times in the past. Maybe he did it in the course of this conversation, and I'm sure he's going to be doing it again. Well, then he's probably going to react in a very different way and not be defensive, but probably be humble. Probably admit to the fact that what she's saying has been true, and it might even be true in the context of the argument they're getting into right now. See the difference between pride and humility? A proud person has a high view, going to attack the person who is attacking them and defending their character. A humble person has a biblical view of who they really are. The proud person does not. The humble person has a biblical view, a low view of who they really are, and they're not going to respond defensively because they're agreeing with the person who's saying they're rude or they're unkind or they're mean and so forth and so on, unloving and many other things as well. Now, a proud person who has a high opinion of themselves, they will almost always get defensive and they will quarrel and fight. Proverbs chapter 13 says this about a proud person, a person who has a high opinion of themselves. Proverbs 13:10 says this: pride only breeds quarrels. Pride only breeds quarrels, or a proud person will only multiply quarrels. If you argue with a proud person, they are going to multiply those quarrels over and over and over again. A proud person will never put a quarrel out. They will multiply the quarrels. For example, husband and wife are quarreling about money. He gets defensive, and he's probably going to multiply it. Now that quarreling over money will shift to quarreling and getting defensive over last year's vacation, and then it'll drift into something else because they're not listening, they're not paying attention, they're not humble, and so if they're just going to shift their attentions from one quarrel to another because they're proud and they're defensive and they're arrogant And that's what proud people do, is they multiply quarrels. A humble person, here's what's cool about a humble person. A humble person is simply not going to quarrel with you. You're not going to get a quarrel and a fight and an argument and a dispute with a humble person. They're just going to admit that they're a lowly person. They what they're being accused as has been true. It might be true. It'll certainly be true in the future. And I'm just not going to argue with you about that, because you're right. I was angry. I was unkind. I was unloving, because I know I'm capable of being that way, and I see myself having been that way again. So I'm not going to quarrel and fight with you. It only takes one person to prevent a quarrel and fight from breeding, and that is a humble person who's willing to admit that they were wrong, because the Bible says they're low and they're capable of it, and then there's a very good chance that what the wife is saying has been true, is being true, and will probably be true in the future. And when accused, they will wisely and humbly accept the fact that, okay. Now, if the wife is accusing him of something that he didn't do, you were really rude there, he might say, he will humbly say, I am very capable of being rude. I'm not really sure I was rude in that situation. Can you tell me why you thought I was rude? Well, you raised your voice and you pointed your finger at me and you wagged your finger, and I don't like it when you do that. Well, you know what? You're right. I did get loud. I did raise my voice, and I did wag my finger. And that's not right. And you're right. I apologize for that. I should not have done that. You're right. That was a rude thing to do, and I apologize for that. A proud person will not do that. A proud person will say, well, I raised my voice because you weren't listening to me. I wagged my finger because you weren't paying attention. You're not paying attention. And that's what a proud person will do. Very, very different from someone who is humble. So, why do we get defensive? Why do we defend ourselves so reactionary and viscerally? Not because of what's being said to us, and not because we're coming under attack, not because the person is exaggerating. We're reacting defensively because we're proud. And therefore, we can't blame when we respond defensively to our children, when we respond defensively to our bosses, when we respond badly to our employees, or whoever it might be. When we get defensive like that, we have no one to blame but ourselves, and probably our own pride. We can't blame getting defensive on our husbands, our wives, our children, employers, or whoever it might be. Defensiveness originates in a proud heart. And that's why when we are proud and we do get defensive, we have no one to blame but ourselves. And then we should come clean. We should own it and say, I'm sorry. You know what? I have been proud, and therefore I have been defensive, and I did wag my finger, and I have no one to blame but myself, and I'm sorry, and will you please forgive me for getting defensive? Okay. Proud person will do that. A humble person will. But that's what we all should do when we find ourselves getting defensive. We should pause, stop, and own it, that defensive reaction, and ask forgiveness from the person who we may be discussing, having a dispute with. Okay? That's reason number one as to why we get defensive. That's one side of the coin as to why we get defensive. Why? Because we're not humble, we're proud, and we have to own that. We can't blame that on the person that we might be discussing. In video number 10 of Quarreling and Fighting, we're going to look at the second reason as to why people get defensive. I hope that's helpful. I think if you'll stay tuned to number 3 as well, we're going to be getting into a second reason why you and I and others get defensive, and what God would want us to learn about that. Okay? Look forward to being with you then.